Hello, this is the tale of my south-facing camera that I documented having died in one of my previous videos. I thought I would explain all of the various things that I tried to determine just what condition it was in. So it started off on a nice Saturday morning when the power went off. And when I went to restart everything, I noticed that it couldn't get images from that camera. And so when I went downstairs to take a look at it, I noticed that it was trying to negotiate the power between the power over Ethernet switch and the camera itself. So I thought that I would make this video to kind of give a brief overview of what power over Ethernet is and to describe the troubleshooting steps that I took to determine what was what. So at the very start, I noticed that the switch was trying to power the camera, and the red LED on the switch indicates that it detected something drawing power. So when you plug a power over Ethernet IP camera into it, the red light initially goes on. It figures out what the power requirements are supposed to be. It temporarily goes off and then it goes back on again, providing full power. And then very shortly later, the camera initializes and starts the Ethernet communication, and then the green light also goes on. That's what normally happens. And what I noticed with the south-facing camera was that the power light would briefly flash, and when it would go off, I could hear something chirping inside the switch. So it would just temporarily flash, and then just as it's going off, the power supply would kind of give a like it would flash periodically and chirp at the same time. So it would go. And it was my experience from other electronics based projects that it sounded to me like there was some kind of overload and the switch was shutting that port down because the switch had detected a short. At that point, I disconnected the camera, went outside, took the camera off of my deck, brought it back in the house, and plugged it straight into the switch, and noticed that it was doing the same thing. So then I was trying to determine what exactly was the fault. The first thing that I wanted to do was take it apart, and because I suspected that there might have been some kind of water ingress and or short and or damage, I figured that there should be some kind of visual indication. So I took it apart, and just keep this diagram in mind. The switch is over here, and I've got a cable that kind of runs across, not like this here, but it basically is a fair length of cable that goes outside. And this is the connector. And so the camera has a short little bit of Ethernet cable that kind of sticks out, and there's a weatherproof connector on the end. So this represents that connector. And inside the camera, the cable splits into two separate plugs. One plug goes to the power socket on the power board. The second one is the data socket. And then there's a separate cable that connects the power board to the main board. And the main board is dual-sided, so there are components on both sides. One side would be the processor and a bunch of other circuitry, and the other side is the CCD sensor and an adapter where the lens is attached to. And so that's what this represents. This represents the lens housing. There's the main board. There's a separate connection that goes from the main board to the infrared board, and all of this is housed inside a weatherproof case. So when I took it apart, I noticed that there was definitely a lot of water ingress. There was moisture on the infrared board itself, and when I tipped it over, there was a small amount of water that was coming out. The first board that I was able to look at was the power board, And immediately I noticed in this corner there was some kind of discoloration. So I took some rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip and I just kind of wiped that as best as I could to see what was just surface staining and what was actual corrosion. After I did that and I looked at it again, this corner seemed to have cleaned up, although just now noticing it looks like there's still a little bit over here that might be part of the problem. But at that point, it looked to me like the power board was relatively still intact, that there was no obvious shorting or compromise of the circuitry. After I cleaned the power board, I tried it again and it still wouldn't work. And so at that point, I started to remove certain components from the circuitry. And then I just tried this again. And when I tried just the power board and I plugged it in, I noticed that it was still trying to do the power negotiation. However, it didn't seem to have that chirping sound coming from the switch. And so at that point, that's when I kind of suspected that there was a short, not on the power board, but on the main board. And so then I made that video to say that it looks like my security camera died. I figured, well, I could just box it up and use it for parts should the other ones start to fail, such as, for example, the infrared board looks like it might still be salvageable and I might be able to use part of the housing or whatever. So I was debating what to do with that camera, whether I should just toss it out or keep it as parts. When I decided I was going to take another look at it, but this time I was going to use my bench power supply to see if I could wake it up somehow. And so I just focused on the key electronics, suspecting that there might have been a short somewhere. I dialed the current down quite low on the power supply and I applied power to these two pins right here. One of them is 12 volts, the other one is ground. And I slowly increased the voltage, and I didn't see the power supply complain too loudly that there was any kind of short. And when I finally got to 12 volts, it did seem to come to life. I don't have a picture of the main board, but there is an LED on that other one, and I noticed that the light on the main board was glowing. So that suggested to me that maybe there wasn't a short on the circuit board after all. So where could the problem be? It seemed, for all intents and purposes, that maybe it would function as it should, and yet the PoE switch was tripping. And so I decided I was going to make a split data power cable and provide power externally through the power supply and see if the camera was functioning. So the next thing that I thought I was going to do would be to create a special adapter and apply the appropriate voltage on the external connector to see if that would work. And this is where I ran into a little bit of a problem, because when I did research on the pinout for power over Ethernet, I came across diagrams like this where I saw a plus and a minus and a plus and a minus and DC, DC, etc. And I saw other diagrams like this, and I didn't come back to these diagrams to confirm exactly what was going on. And in my mind, this was one of those things where I just got it in my head that it was going to be wired a certain way. And I kind of had this diagram in my head, and in a way I was thinking that each of the power data pairs were going to be positive, minus, just like they are for the signals, so that it would minimize or eliminate as much inductively coupled noise. And especially if you were to run this in an industrial setting, for example, and you've got a nearby industrial motor that turns on, it could possibly induce enough noise on the voltage lines to cause interference and or damage to the electronics. So that's why I was thinking in my mind the industry standard would have been to connect a positive and a minus to each of these pairs. And the reason why they would have two pairs for the power would be to ensure that there was enough current over fairly long wires to provide enough power to the device remotely. That's what was in my mind when I was trying to test and isolate the fault of the camera on the bench. And so I turned around, and over here, when I had the power supply plugged into here, I applied power on pin 4 and pin 5, thinking it was plus and minus. So just to reiterate, in my mind, I was thinking pin 4 would be positive, pin 5 would be minus, pin 7 would be positive, pin 8 would be minus, which would allow each pair to remain configured as if it was a data line. And of course, when I did that, the power supply complained, saying that it saw a dead short. At that point, I just removed everything and I just left the wire open like this, and it still appeared like a dead short as far as the power supply was concerned. And so that's when I got a little bit suspicious, because another possible thing that entered my mind was that over the course of the years, or possibly the last few months, water got in and dripped down along the cable, traveled along the entire length of cable, and started shorting something out further down. Even though it was supposed to be protected from the outside elements, it would not necessarily prevent water ingress going through from inside the cable. So in my mind, I was thinking that there was a short in the cable itself. And at that point, I was thinking, do I cut the end of the cable off to determine if the short is there or not? And I decided, well, so far it doesn't seem like I can retrieve or salvage the camera. So I decided to cut the end of the cable off. I even took the whole thing apart, and on very first inspection, it looked like they did a very bad soldering job on pin 4 and 5 and on pin 7 and 8, and that one of the other possibilities that I was thinking of was that this extra solder blob on pin 4 and 5 over time created enough corrosion in the gap that it started to conduct, and over time it started to conduct enough that it ultimately produced a dead short. So now I have a camera that doesn't have a plug that is weather resistant. So essentially this is all that I had left, and I still wasn't entirely sure if the camera itself worked or not. So I ended up splicing onto the end of this an Ethernet plug, and at this point I rewired it in a slightly different way so that the bench power supply could then power the two wires that go to the power plug on this power board. And then as soon as I did that and turned the power on, the camera came back to life. Without too much more effort after that, I was able to plug it back into my network and access the camera, and sure enough, the camera was providing images once again. So at this point, I needed to find a way to get power to the camera again, and after I had completely destroyed the original plug, I had to find a way to rewire a new one that would be somewhat weatherproof. So my solution to that was, I have a bit of Ethernet cable left over from another project. And so I ended up using a short section of that, and I attached a nice long piece of wire. And on the other end, I needed to find a way to protect the Ethernet plug that is meant to go inside a wall socket. And so what I ended up doing with that was I still had a leftover spice bottle made of glass, and I ended up wrapping the entire length of the wire, because the wire is made of plastic that is not UV resistant. So I ended up using the electrical tape as UV protectant all the way down to the socket, and I ended up just using the spice bottle. I made a few holes on the bottom where the screw-on cover would go on so that I could run the wires inside, and I put the spice bottle upside down so it would look something like that. And so the spice bottle would be this cable would be attached to this end, and so it would come down, and the bottle itself is made of glass, and the screw-on cover is made of plastic, which is probably almost certainly not UV resistant. So I'm going to have to very soon wrap that entire assembly up in electrical tape to keep it shielded from ultraviolet light. And the last thing that I ended up doing was the front of the glass was starting to separate from the screw-on cap. So at first I was going to try to use crazy glue or something else like that, and I didn't have anything handy. So I ended up using one of those hot glue sticks, and so far it seems to be keeping the bulk of the water out. The camera's been operational now for over a week, and it still seems to be functional. So it looks like the camera is not completely dead after all. The last bit of luck that I did have was the power supply for it. And it turns out I bought an external hard drive a few years ago, and the hard drive died, but I kept the external power adapter that came with it. And that power adapter is rated for 12 volts at 1.5 amps. And on the bench power supply, the most that the camera drew was half an amp. So I thought that the power adapter was more than ample, and so all I ended up having to do was to make another adapter inside the house to split the power and the data to the switch over here. And so now what was originally the south facing camera is pointing in the direction of the old north facing camera. At this point I decided to leave the infrared board disconnected completely, because I realized that even at a very low power level, the infrared transmitters are enough to wash everything out, and I still can't see any of the stars. And so the only thing that's not working right now is that the camera has no idea if it is day or night. And as a result, that would mean that this camera is not dead after all. That's going to be it for now. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, I would appreciate the thumbs up, the subscribe, comment below, etc. All that other good stuff. And with that, I'm going to see you in another video soon enough. So bye for now.